As the COVID-19 pandemic strikes and China's credibility concerning its origin and initial spread come into question, countries are discussing decoupling from the communist regime. Such talk is exposing Xi Jinping's carefully cultivated plans to dominate the world stage by controlling international economics, infrastructure, and information. Just Saying explains. Hello there, Just Sayers. I'm Allison Cardival. Thank you so much for joining me. If my voice sounds a little froggy, it's because it's first thing in the morning. I just got up. Got that sleepy voice. Sorry about that, but it's hard to find a quiet time in my house to record with everyone working out of it, right? With the lockdown. I'm kind of interested. Are you guys going out now? We're still staying at home for the next couple of weeks to make sure things don't spike as other people venture out more. We can work from here, so we're doing that, but I'm kind of curious to know what you're up to. Drop me a line and let me know. Also, before we get started here, I want to let you know that I put up an article last week that is an update on a little podcast we did about the chloroquine death in Arizona. Just following that case, it has a death investigation going on now. There's more information about the man's wife. There's disinformation out there too. This is not a homicide case yet, or maybe not ever, but they are investigating as they should under these circumstances. But if you want more details on it, go to the website at www.justsaying.com and look under articles, and you will find it there, as you will find all the other articles we've done before on previous topics, as well as the podcasts themselves. And you can listen right there from the website or off of your favorite platform. Just make sure you follow us on whichever one you choose. Follow the website, though, because honestly, Twitter doesn't like me. I got shadow banned on Twitter like 3 episodes out. And now anything I post is images, they get blocked as being sensitive. The last thing I posted was a meme of Shirley Temple. And Shirley Temple saying, "Oh, thank you," was too sensitive to be seen on Twitter. So I'm just a rebel, I guess, causing too much trouble. And talking about China is not going to help me one bit, but that's the way it goes. Hopefully you will find this and you will be able to hear it, because I think we give a lot of information that you are not getting through your traditional sources, at least not all in one spot. You'll get one side or the other. So let me take a sip of tea here and get my vocal cords warmed up. I guess I'm sillier in the morning. Let's get started and look at what's happening with COVID-19 and how it is threatening the Chinese dream. Since rising to the head of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, in 2012, Xi Jinping has been guiding a lofty mission to elevate China's strength, civilization, harmony, and beauty, as he says. Under his Chinese dream, Xi aims for his country to become a quote-unquote moderately well-off society by the early 2020s and a fully developed nation by 2050. Seems like they're well on their way to the well-off, for more people anyways than they used to have in 2020. Experts speculate that Xi now hopes that as the United States struggles to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, China can recover faster and surpass it to become the #1 economy in the world. In his opening address to the Chinese citizens as their president in 2013, Xi stated that China's people would reach this collective dream through their persistent efforts, an indomitable will to rejuvenate the nation, and the promotion of Chinese socialism. When speaking to President Barack Obama in California in 2013, the newly appointed Chinese president's message was more inclusive. He said, quote, "By the Chinese dream, we seek to have economic prosperity, national renewal, and people's well-being. The Chinese dream is about cooperation, development, peace, and win-win. And it is connected to the American dream and the beautiful dreams people in other countries may have," unquote. I guess that's a case of know your audience and who you're talking to. Now, skip ahead to 2018. And China's Communist Party has severely clamped down on previously emerging freedoms. It has increased its state surveillance and censorship programs. And critics say Chairman Xi has also used a massive anti-corruption campaign to purge or sideline his political rivals. And when I say massive, we're talking 2 million party members that were investigated to see whether or not they were in line with Xi's worldview and then handled accordingly, I guess. Since the late 80s, China has imposed a 2-term limit on its president, meaning Xi was due to step down after 10 years by 2023. Evidently, though, Xi didn't believe his dreams would be complete by then. Instead of presenting a potential successor during the 2018 Penannual Communist Party Congress, as was traditional, Xi consolidated his power. Members voted to change the party's constitution to include his name and his own political ideology. At the time, the BBC reported that this elevated his status to the level of the party's founder, Chairman Mao. Workers at state factories, college students, and school children alike are now required to study the Xi Jinping Thought on Socialism with Chinese Characteristics for the New Era. That's the name of it. And it is what the party is now branding as a new chapter in modern communism political ideology. Also, under Xi's direction at that Congress, party delegates removed the term limits on the presidency. So now, in theory at least, Xi can remain president for the rest of his life. If you pay attention to these moves, you can see why there are some who are now talking about decoupling. Because it seems China's borders do not confine Xi's ambitions. Since his rise to power, the CCP has promoted initiatives to purchase foreign companies and develop international infrastructures while investing heavily in various media outlets to quietly increase its influence on the world's economy and its flow of information. The pandemic put a spotlight on how dependent many countries are on China for critical supplies like personal protection equipment and medications. Senator Tom Cotton and Representative Mike Gallagher pointed this out in a recent op-ed, saying, just years after the United States granted China special trade privileges in 2000, the last penicillin plant in America closed down. American factories that made aspirin, vitamin C, and other essential medicine closed after that, put out of business by China's predatory pricing. The United States is dangerously dependent for pharmaceuticals on the very regime whose failures and cover-ups caused this deadly pandemic to spiral out of control, unquote. They and other lawmakers believe this needs to change and say they have a plan to end America's dependence on Chinese drugs and take back our ability to make pharmaceuticals and medical devices right here in America. The pair advocates for decoupling America's medical supply chain from China, saying we can begin to undo the damage now. The antidote to our dependence on Chinese drugs is to stop buying them and take back our ability to make basic medicine in America. Chinese dependence was a source of debate in places like Great Britain, too, even before the coronavirus emerged. Earlier this year, Prime Minister Boris Johnson gave the Chinese telecom giant Huawei permission to build part of Britain's 5G network. Now, however, the pandemic has reignited concerns that this will make British technology too dependent on China and pose an intelligence risk. In light of the pandemic, some senior lawmakers are again urging the UK government to reconsider its position. Other countries, including India, Germany, and Australia, have already tightened foreign investment rules to try and move away from China. These governments hope to increase their domestic capacity to produce essential materials without fear that local companies might be bought out by foreign investors. India's new restrictions didn't name China explicitly. Still, a spokesperson at the Chinese embassy in New Delhi said in a recent statement that, quote, "The impact of the policy on Chinese investors is clear." It also said, "We hope India would revise relevant discriminatory practices, treat investments from different countries equally, and foster an open, fair, and equitable business environment," unquote. Translation: the Chinese government does not like the spotlight that is being thrown on it by the COVID-19 virus, and it is on the verge of panic over losing these business avenues that it has been building up over the past decade or so. Decoupling is not always straightforward, though. You need to look no further than the United States to see just how difficult these kinds of efforts might prove to be. China was the United States' largest supplier of imported goods in 2018 at over $500 billion, a number that is 60% higher than it was in 2008, I believe it was. A Harvard Business School professor who has written on U.S.-China supply chain issues recently told The Atlantic, quote, "The world is dependent on China for manufacturing." He believes decoupling wouldn't just impact medical supplies, it would also affect electronics, machinery, furniture, toys, and more. More than 21% of all items the United States imported in 2018 came from China. Because of this, he says, quote, "I'm in the school that talk is cheap, and if you really want to go down that path, then you have to be prepared for the consequences," unquote. That's my tea. Oh, which is from China. I'm no different. It's true. China is deeply embedded in the United States, not just by what we import, but even through things we think we are making ourselves. Since Xi took over, Chinese companies have aggressively been buying American companies. When COVID-19 infections forced Smithfield Foods to close one of its meatpacking plants that provides about 5% of the U.S. pork supply, many were surprised to learn that the Virginia-based American food industry icon is now owned by China. It was purchased by a company that belongs to a member of the CCP's elite in 2013 for almost $5 billion. It's not the only one. After more than 100 years of making stoves, refrigerators, washers, and dryers as an American company, General Electric's appliance division is now Chinese-owned. It sold for $5.4 billion in 2016. If you like to stay in luxury hotels like Waldorf, Ritz, Four Seasons, or Starwood, your stay likely supports China, since at least part of these brands are now owned by Chinese companies that in turn are controlled by the communist government. You're in the same position if you like going to the movies. AMC and Carmike Cinemas are both owned by a Chinese company, the same one that owns Legendary Studios. Legendary has financed films like the Jurassic World and Godzilla franchises, just as an example. It'll be interesting to see if movie theaters can come back after everyone has pushed even the industry more towards streaming. Did you know that new Chris Hemsworth movie, Extraction, it's now going to be eligible for the Oscars, even though it's never going to touch theaters? And actually, it never was intended to. It was made by Netflix. But other companies are following suit to push their movies out during the lockdown and skip the theaters altogether. It's going to cause problems. China's not going to like that either. But I digress. Ingram Micro's name may not be necessarily familiar to consumers, but the company distributes everything from Apple iPhones to Cisco's network equipment. Last year, China's H&A Group bought the company for around $6 billion. Speaking of H&A, let's talk a bit about its rise and fall. Once touted as China's boldest independent conglomerate, in the wake of COVID-19 shutdowns, it is now being taken over by the Chinese government directly. H&A Group, which Qin Feng started as an airline, rapidly diversed through investments in real estate, finance, and overseas acquisitions. Notable early investors included George Soros. Then in 2015, it began a $40 billion shopping spree that included not only Ingram Micro, but shares in Hilton, Deutsche Bank, and a myriad of other companies. By the end of 2017, H&A's international assets peaked at above $170 billion. Its tentacles are sticky, twisted, and trace back to obfuscated backers. But its massive borrowing was catching up to it even before the COVID plague hit Wuhan. In April, government officials in the province where the company is based reportedly established what is called a working group that includes new corporate officers to help H&A Group solve its financial woes. That reorder took Qin out of the chairman's chair. The publication Industry Week says that through strategic purchases, China is also trying to influence America's energy supplies. Quote, since 2009, Chinese companies have invested billions of dollars acquiring significant percentages of shares of energy companies such as the AES Corp, Chesapeake Energy, and oil and gas assets. In 2010, China Communications Construction Company bought 100% of Freed Goldman United, and in 2012, a Tech Wind Power bought 100% of Cirrus Wind Energy. 100%. Think about that. 2010, 2012, we're making a push. We're giving government money to establish all of these alternative energy sources. Who's that money going to, really, ultimately, in the end? We set them up and China bought them. Interesting. You see, unlike many other countries, the United States allows 100% foreign ownership of its businesses. This is something rarely reciprocated. But foreign purchases here are only blocked when there are strictly defined national security issues. In contrast, the Chinese government allows foreign ownership in only a few annually selected industry sectors and usually requires joint ventures with Chinese corporations. China's buying spree reached far and wide. In 2016, a Chinese-led group of investors actually offered to buy the Chicago Stock Exchange. But in 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission rejected the acquisition. It took 2 years for that to be turned down. Before its halt, the proposed deal had sparked an uproar on Capitol Hill and was criticized by Donald Trump during the presidential campaign. Indeed, President Trump's election marked a shift in American attitudes towards China. Just 6 days after Trump took office in 2017, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission held a hearing on Chinese investment. Robert D. Atkinson, president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, testified, quote, "For many years, China has recycled the earnings from its large and sustained trade deficit with the United States into U.S. Treasury bills. But the last few years have seen a marked increase in the amount of inward foreign direct investment, FDI, from China to the United States across a range of industries. While the underlying motivation for some of this investment is commercial, at least 1/3 is from Chinese state-owned enterprises. And it is likely that considerably more is guided and supported by the Chinese government, specifically targeting sectors that are strategically important for U.S. national security or economic leadership," unquote. Later that year, legislation was introduced to modernize the national security review of potential foreign investments in the United States. Congressman Robert Pittenger laid out its goals in a press release like this. Chinese investment in the United States increased more than 900% between 2010 and 2016. Much of this investment was part of a strategic, coordinated Chinese government effort to target critical American infrastructure. China is buying American companies at a breathtaking pace. While some are legitimate business investments, many others are part of a backdoor effort to compromise U.S. national security. For example, China recently attempted to purchase a U.S. missile defense supplier using a shell company to evade detection. The global economy presents new security risks, and our bipartisan legislation provides Washington the necessary tools to better attack and evaluate Chinese investment. This bill is known as the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, and it was passed into law with overwhelming bipartisan support in August of 2018. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin says, quote, "These regulations strengthen our national security and modernize the investment review process," quote. So as you can see, even before COVID-19, American policy had taken a big shift, at least to recognizing openly what China had been doing for the past decade. And on a timeline, that occurred right when Trump took office. All those purchases that I had mentioned all happened 2016 and before. Businesses in the United States have not been China's only target, though. In countries with fewer business assets, the push to obtain Xi's Chinese dream has taken a different tact. The Chinese government adopted the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a global development strategy, in 2015. The BRI, as it's called, involves infrastructure development and investments in some 70 countries and international organizations throughout Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. The Chinese government calls the initiative, quote, "a bid to enhance regional connectivity and embrace a brighter future," unquote. They're very poetic, even as politicians. Many observers, however, see it as a push to achieve Chinese dominance in global affairs, utilizing a China-centered trading network. These critics accuse the communist government of luring poor countries into so-called debt trap diplomacy by providing overly burdensome loans for much-needed infrastructure projects and then taking control of the assets when nations fail to pay off the debt. The conditions of these loans often remain private, and the loaned money routinely goes to pay contractors directly from the creditor's country. Meaning, while some individuals may make money, the country as a whole may not benefit. There are also accusations that the politicians in charge get to line their pockets along the way. There's a lot of backdoor ways that are used to channel money to the people who are making the decisions to let China in. Mark Green is the administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development and has also held the post of United States Ambassador to Tanzania. A year ago, he wrote about how China's Belt and Road Initiative threatens the ability of developing countries to achieve self-reliance. In an op-ed for foreignpolicy.com, he wrote, "The fact that poorer countries struggle with debt is nothing new, but after years of successful efforts to reduce their debt burden, they are once again going into the red. Unlike before, developing countries' strategic assets, such as resources, mineral deposits, port access rights, and the like, are now targeted by creditors as collateral in many of these predatory deals." Unquote. Guess who holds most of these overly burdensome debts? Yes, it's China. The International Monetary Fund shows that China's contribution nearly doubled between 2013 and 2016. The public debt these impoverished countries owes China jumped from just over 6% to more than 11.5%. And Beijing's lending continues to expand through its BRI initiative. Green added, noting a lack of economic feasibility of some BRI projects, many observers suspect that the initiative is partly motivated by China's desire to stimulate its own economy, obtain strategic assets, and convert its economic access into political and strategic influence in recipient nations. Unquote. I mean, let's face it, when a country provides foreign aid, it's always looking to get a favorable response, right? But what they're saying is this takes it to a much greater extreme. Foreign aid, you're saying, here you go, we're helping you out. But in this case, they are directly seizing assets in return for that aid. As COVID-19 continues to lock down nation after nation, China's debt trap diplomacy is now coming under increased fire. In April, Tanzania's president canceled a $10 billion Chinese loan, saying, quote, "Only a drunkard would accept these terms," unquote. Local media reports say his predecessor signed the agreement to let Chinese investors build a port on the condition that they would get 30 years to guarantee the loan and a 99 years uninterrupted lease to use it. Another shocking demand accepted by the former president's administration was that the Tanzanian government would have absolutely no power to raise concerns over how the Chinese used the port during the lease. Basically just give it to them. They can do whatever they want. Military, pollute it, I don't know. Not a good deal, though. It was not a good deal for the country. And the new president is backing out. The Kenyan government has also raised issues with China's plan to take over one of its critical seaports after the African nation failed to clear its debts. Meanwhile, Beijing already took control of Sri Lanka's Hambantota port after the island nation was unable to pay part of its massive Belt and Road loan. The CCP's growing presence in Africa is just one of the numerous areas of concern for Western policymakers as the battle for political and economic influence between the United States and China plays out across the globe. How people react to the communist regime's next steps, both in China and throughout the rest of the world, will prove vital to the CCP's position and tactics going forward. And this is not something Beijing is leaving to chance. That's why on the next Just Saying, we are going to focus on China's use of media and propaganda, especially how it plays now against the backdrop of COVID-19. As always, you can agree or disagree. I'm just saying. Because this is such a complicated, heavy topic, I decided to break it into 2 parts. So this is where we're going to stop now, but make sure you check back because part 2 is going to be posted very quickly. I've already got all the research and it's written. Just have to put it together and get it out to you. Thank you for joining me. Remember, follow on social media and on the website so we can keep you up to date on what's happening. Until then, be safe and God bless.